want to welcome everybody to the Right Way Up here at the Gloucester Writers Center in beautiful downtown East Gloucester this August. And we have the pleasure of having Mark Kurlansky with us to talk about his book, Salmon, which is out and available in bookstores and online, I should think. Mark, welcome. And where do we find you today, if you could tell our audience?
You find me in Manhattan. I wish you could find me in Gloucester, but that ain't happening.
Well, I wish you were here too. And I would just tell our audience that Mark is the author of many books, maybe too long to go into here, Cod and Salt and fish
books.
many books and many awards, Dayton Literary Peace Prize and James Beard Award, and written for, well, I guess it would be a better use of time for you to tell us the periodicals and journals that you haven't written for. It's a long list, yes?
Yeah, it's a pretty long list. I was a full-time working journalist for about 15 years. So I wrote for, as a foreign correspondent for a number of newspapers and wrote for a lot of magazines.
Well, of course, you know, this, you know, here it is, we're at the Writers Center in Gloucester, so I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about not only the writing, the art of writing, the forms that you take, but also about fish itself, because those are two subjects which coincide here. One of the things that I noticed in reading the book and learning a little bit more about you was that your books are translated into many languages. How is that for an author to feel about your work being translated?
Yeah, I kind of lost track. It's over 25 languages. I'm not sure how many languages at this point, but a lot. And I always think of, I used to know Isaac Bashevis Singer, whose first language was Yiddish. And he told me that he had an excellent Japanese translator. And I said, how do you know? And he said, well, you know, I go to Japan sometimes and I talk to people and we all seem to be talking about the same book. So, you know, I don't know. I'm fluent in a few languages, but not 25.
It's a good feeling, yes, to have your work taken from its original language. And
well, I like that it's available to people, to non-English speaking people.
Yes.
Really, you know, if you have a choice, I'd rather you read it in English. But if you can't read English, I'm glad it's available.
Now, I don't know, but I think it might be I don't know if it's a true rumor or a false rumor that you have. Did you go commercial fishing at some point?
I did.
I did. So you've peed in salt water, so you know the sport fishing and the commercial fishing divide, which I hopefully will come to because it's a very interesting point of convergence.
I'm on both sides of it.
Got it. Well, not everybody can see it from both sides, and it's a very...
Well, I certainly can. I mean, I not only have I been a commercial fisherman, but I have a great attraction to commercial fishing, and I go out on commercial boats actually whenever I can. I went out on a couple in Alaska for salmon. I love commercial fishing.
Right.
I'm also a very active sports fisherman. In fact, my next book after this is about fly fishing.
Oh, great. Well, we'll look forward to that.
The history and culture of fly fishing.
Yes, well, you go into it a little bit here, and so hopefully we'll have time to get into that. But I wanted to say about the book that it's, well, it's called Salmon, but it's about salmon the way, you know, Moby Dick is about a whale. I mean, it's really not, I mean, it's about the salmon, but it's really about us in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, my books are almost never really about what they're supposed to be about. That's the fun of it. You start off with really a metaphor for something else. But it is about salmon. I mean, it is literally about salmon. But the reason I chose to write a book about salmon was to make another point. You know, if you go back probably those people in Gloucester know that in 1997, I came out with a book about cod. And this was at a time when the northern stock on the Grand Banks had recently collapsed, and people were for the first time thinking about problems of fishery management and the whole subject of overfishing. And I say for the first time because, I mean, when I was fishing commercially in the mid-1960s, it was all fishermen talked about. You know, fishermen have been talking about this issue much longer than environmentalists have.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea really took off. I might be partly responsible. I don't like to think I am, but I may be. And people almost obsessed by this, are almost obsessed by this notion of overfishing. There is overfishing, it is an issue, but it is not the issue. I don't even think it's the most important issue. And when I looked at fisheries, including the cod fishery in New England, it was very clear to me that overfishing was just a very small part of the problem.
Right.
And I chose to write a book about salmon because salmon illustrates this better than any fish I could ever think of. I mean, it's, there really isn't a lot of an issue of overfishing. There was, but most of it has been redone or shut down. It's actually very easy to monitor a salmon fishery, much easier than a cod fishery, because you see them all, and they have a very precise life cycle, and you know where they are, and so you can just count them as they come in the river. Literally count them. You see them and you count them, and when enough salmon are spawning,
Mm-hmm. Right.
tell the fishermen how many fish they can take, and still have it sustainable. It's really, you know, relative to something like cod, haddock, it's quite easy. But also, you know, Atlantic salmon has been doing so badly that they're basically, there's almost no commercial fishing of Atlantic salmon.
Right. Right.
And yet, salmon stocks keep declining. You know, I mean, if you look at the fleet in Gloucester, it certainly isn't the deadly fleet it once was, and yet, you know, there's still problems with cod stocks in the Gulf of Maine. You know, why is that? It's because of a lot of other things.
Right. And you mentioned, you know, pollution and how, you know, whether it's a point source or non-point source discharges and how they affect, you know, fish in their larval stage and the mortality rates.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a fishery whose only problem was overfishing, that would be great. That would be such a simple problem. You know, in the case of salmon, it's pollution and bad farming practices and pesticides and deforestation and the damming of rivers and climate change and climate change and climate change.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, I think that came through loud and clear in the book, was that there are these other factors which come into play when we're trying to figure out where the fish are going. I mean, I think you'll agree that it's in a strange, especially here in town, that, you know, it is a law of nature that we have to kill that which sustains us in a way, but there's a way to do it so that in a way that it makes sense. I mean, I wanted to take a moment, if you could, because I think it's stated quite well in the epilogue of your book, and if we could just get you to read a little bit from it, that would be great. I'm thinking of the first couple of paragraphs, and I think you had some thoughts about what would bring this to folks' attention in a very direct way.
Well, can I just go into this a little before I
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Background on this, because I mean, particularly climate change. You know, obviously, if the Earth is warming, that's a disaster for a fish that can't live and reproduce in water that's warmer than 68 degrees. So you see, in Alaska, it's been having warm summers and they've been having good salmon runs, but
Mhm.
the spawning numbers have been down because the water has been too warm. When you have the polar ice cap melting, the salinity of the water is changed, which affects the whole life cycle. But bigger than any of those things, carbon, carbon dioxide, 1 part carbon, 2 parts oxygen, loves water. So something like 1/3 of all of the carbon that's produced in the world ends up in the ocean. So if you have some guy who's driving a big SUV in Indiana, I just pick on Indiana because I like Indiana. He's actually damaging fish in the Atlantic without even thinking about it. And what happens is that the carbon goes into the water, and hydrogen ions increase and carbonate decreases. And the result of that is that things like zooplankton and capelin, those little fish that cod also like to eat,
Forage fish, yeah.
are not growing as large as they were. And so there isn't enough food. There is not enough food for the fish that live in the ocean. The carrying capacity of the North Atlantic is diminished. Now, in 40 years of writing about environmental issues, this is the scariest thing I've ever heard. I mean, if the ocean can no longer feed the fish that are in it, we are in very deep trouble. And this is why salmon are not returning at the rates they used to. So that even though you don't have commercial fishing, you have less and less salmon. They spawn in the rivers, they go out to sea, and they don't come back.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, and this is despite efforts to do husbandry and hatcheries and
over $1 billion over years in the Connecticut River. Could not get a significant amount of salmon to come back. They've had some success in the Penobscot by tearing down dams, but still not the returns that they were hoping for. Nobody has the returns they're hoping for, and it's because of climate change. But
right, I was just going to. I'm sorry.
Also, other things too, and I was thinking as I was writing the book. So I was looking at the whole history of things going back to the Romans. But if you look particularly at the British in the Industrial Revolution, and they built all these dams so that they could power mills on the riverbanks. And then these mills dumped pollution into the rivers, and they completely killed the rivers. And then it was people of British origin who went to New England and did the exact same thing. And then it was people of New England origin who went to the Pacific Northwest and said, the rivers here are so powerful, it's a tremendous energy source, and we can just build a huge economy just by damming these rivers. It destroyed all the salmon river, destroyed the Columbia, the greatest salmon river maybe in the world. So I'm writing all this and I'm thinking, oh, this is very odd. How come nobody ever learns? And then I realized the revelation that came to me is that they're not trying to learn because they don't consider it a failure. The British created the greatest industrial power in the world in the Industrial Revolution. New England was the greatest industrial force in America. The Pacific Northwest, which had very little economic activity, became this huge economic powerhouse. These are cited as great success stories. And so what you realize is that our whole concept of economic development is wrong. You can develop an economy and you can create jobs without destroying the planet.
Well, but you did give us hope in the book there that saying in effect that if we can save the planet, the salmon will be okay. So, I mean,
Well, that's it. That's all you really have to do is save the planet, and then the salmon will be fine. But, you know,
but there is that driving force of the price of fuel and the ice and the insurance for the boat that drives the whole process forward, so that you have to get to your break-even point by killing a lot of fish just so that you can get to the next stage of profitability. Yeah?
that's what I mean about the economic model being
Yes.
wrong. It's, you know, what says everything is the fact that when the economy is booming, the environment is very bad. The carbon footprint is much larger. Right now, when the economy is very bad, it's actually fairly good for the economy, much less carbon being put there. So what is wrong with the economy that if it does well, it's destroying us, and if it does poorly, it's not?
Well, I think that brings us to that point in the epilogue that I would like you to read. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, very good. It's 374. You got it. Okay.
It's towards the end of the book, but I can read the end of the book. There isn't a spoiler alert because.
Well, no, but I mean, yeah, from the outset.
Okay, from the outset, human beings have had largely the same concept of economic development: dominate and tame nature. Nature is seemingly useless raw material that we can transform in order to build a comfortable, orderly, and prosperous life. In physics, there is a rule known as the second law of thermodynamics. I don't know what the first law is. The second law, which holds that no matter how the universe tries to establish order, the total amount of disorder increases. We see this law in microcosm on Earth in the history of human development. Economic development is supposed to create order out of the disorder of wildlife. But the more it is imposed, the more disorder this creates. A clear sign that the economic model is part of the problem is the fact that in times of economic recession, carbon emissions decline, and in times of prosperity, they increase. We do more damage when we prosper. Do you want me to go on?
Well, I mean, I would like to talk about that section because, you know, that it's sort of counterintuitive, but yet it's true. And so, you know, and you say in the book, you don't want to be the "I told you so" guy, but until that that model is changed or somehow redeveloped, we're in that cycle. And if it's
what I'm saying is that we have to drastically rethink the whole thing.
Yeah, and so where does that lead you to, that particular thought in terms of how to do that?
Well, you know, to begin with, the government tends to have this litmus test. You know, does this create jobs? The litmus test should be, will this do damage? Because if it does damage, these jobs in the long run aren't going to be worth anything. You know, they should ask themselves, will this create sustainable jobs? You have to rethink. I mean, so many of the ideas we now see don't work. Fossil fuel, we don't need fossil fuel anymore, really at all. And the idea that damming rivers is a good way of getting energy also turns out not to be a good idea. I mean, we have these so-called alternative energy sources are alternatives. You can't, right, there's a big issue in New England now about buying energy from Canada that's creating electric dams. This is a crazy thing because what are New Englanders saying if they say, yes, we want to buy this? We're saying, okay, destroy the earth, but do it in Canada. It makes no sense.
So you're saying that, and essentially, that we have to start from a different premise, not so much, you know, what is it going to what's the profit margin for this quarter, and is this going to create a lot of jobs? We have to ask, is there a harm done here first?
And if there's not a harm, if it's something positive like solar energy, then you ask yourself, how do we build this as an industry that creates jobs and makes it a prosperous economy? And people are asking that, and they are doing that. And if the U.S. continues in its current policies, it's not going to be an energy leader. Countries in Europe and Asia that are building their economies on alternative energy are going to be the leaders, and we're going to be stuck with this old-fashioned oil and gas.
But it does turn out in the course of reading your book that there were some cultures that had sort of figured this out in a way. And we're talking about folks that were here before Europeans arrived and how their fisheries evolved. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's very interesting to look at Native Americans and the whole attitude of European Americans. So they came here and they saw the Native Americans really focused a lot on fishing salmon, New England and Atlantic Canada and on the West Coast. And they didn't run out of them. The stocks didn't diminish. So, why is that, the European Americans asked? The answer can never be, because they were doing things right and we were doing them wrong. That's an unacceptable solution. So what was concluded is that the natives, first of all, weren't good enough fishermen to catch too many fish. And second of all, they were just sustenance fishermen and weren't doing it for trade or commerce. Both completely wrong. They were very commercial. The tribes traded with each other. Salmon was a very commercial product. And they were extremely skillful fishermen. So much so that, the white people, like Lewis and Clark, if they wanted salmon, they just had to find themselves an Indian because they couldn't do it nearly as well. So
I was going to say, is that in some respect because, salmon is its own worst enemy? It always comes home. It always, you talk about it always jumps at bait. And, is that part of the equation too?
Well, what was different about the Native Americans was, first of all, they saw it as a gift from God. So that implies a certain amount of respect, not only because it's a good thing to be respectful to gods, but also because if you're not going to get the gift anymore. And so the way they looked at it was that if you don't treat the river right, salmon, they're not going to send salmon in anymore, which, as we know, is true. Not exactly the way we saw it. They didn't really understand that they were born in the river and they came back to where they were born. They just thought salmon came in every year to provide them with food. And if they didn't treat the river right, they wouldn't come in and they wouldn't get the food.
Even the remains of the salmon, yeah?
Yes, you had to put them back in the river and in the right way. And you had to be very careful and respectful about what you did with the river. And, if we had done that, the salmon would have been fine. We didn't respect the rivers. The notion, the native notion, and I don't want to over-idealize natives because, they have been forced into situations now where they're also doing things they shouldn't be doing. But the original native concept was right, that you have to treat these things with respect because it's a gift that you won't get if you don't treat it right.
That turns out to be the case, it seems.
Yes.
Well, I did want to return to that, and we spoke about it just at the get-go about and it plays into what you're just talking about, the commercial versus sport divide there, because this point where it's understood that the fish are going to be, to meet the demand of the people on the beach that want the fish, you're going to have to do these things that are exploiting the resource to the point where it may not be there in commercially exploitable quantities going forward. So
This is an interesting thing for Gloucester, because for
yeah,
years I had heard commercial fishermen in Gloucester talk about how the sports fishermen were conspiring to close
yes,
down the commercial fisheries so that they could have it all to themselves. Um, Now, there's a certain amount of paranoia there because, I mean, commercial fishermen don't want brown fish. It's boring to fish for cod. Sports fishermen aren't after cod and haddock. They are after salmon. Um, and they have done as predicted. Charles Bukowski said that the definition of a paranoid was a man in possession of all the facts. Um, uh, Sports fishermen have lobbied very hard to close commercial fisheries, salmon, not
hmm right.
not cod, brown fish, the Gloucester fish. So, because I just picture these guys, all you guys in Gloucester sitting there saying, "Yep, I told you so." But no, it's different. This is specifically salmon, because salmon is an extremely popular sports fish, um, but also you can fish it without damaging the stocks through such things as catch and release. I don't see how catch and release commercial fishing would work.
Right, but you also talked about the sort of psychology of dragging something through the water by the lip and just to let it go. I mean, there's something
Oh,
there.
well, there's a Native Americans uh, think catch and release is a disgrace. In fact, they think fly fishing is a disgrace by and large. Just toying with animals that you're not going to eat.
Yeah.
Very unpopular by Native Americans. Although, in Alaska, it's one of the few good jobs you can get is being a guide for fly fishermen.
Uh-huh.
There are some native fly fishing guides who are quite good at it, but it's kind of offensive to native culture. And as a longtime fly fisherman, I have to say they have a point. And I like Jimmy Carter saying. Jimmy Carter is a very active sports fisherman. He used to play this down. He said it was his best kept secret when he was president, was that he would go to Camp David with the press, and then everybody would go out. He and Rosalind would change their clothes and slip off and fly to Pennsylvania and go fly fishing. And nobody ever knew they were doing it. But he was very active fly fisherman. And he said, if you're troubled by these things, then you shouldn't do it. If you can't work this out in your mind, I'm sort of in between. I don't really understand myself, because I'm troubled by hunting. Not that I'm not troubled by hunters. I don't think they're bad guys or anything, but I have hunted, and I find it extremely sad to kill a deer. I just won't do it anymore because it just made me so sad.
Right.
And I don't feel that way about fish. So, I'm some kind of a hypocrite.
Well, we're all working on our stuff here.
Right.
But yes, well, I guess that's part of the intrigue of catching fish with a line, is to see if you can actually think like one, and so that's part of the thing. But I just want to, because again,
there is a tendency to do things like barbless hooks, which
right.
damage the fish less. And, barbless hook is an interesting concept because it does reduce your chances of catching the fish, especially if you're talking about something really strong and wily like an Atlantic salmon.
But again, this is one of these things where you may think you're doing something that is good. It's sort of like with the mesh size on nets, on draggers. They make them larger so the small fish can get out. But what happens is you wind up catching the larger fish, and then those fish, the stock starts to get smaller because you're weeding out the larger fish. So you think you're doing the right thing, but who knows in the long run. I did want to talk to you because I'm getting a cue. We have about 15 minutes. I just want to make sure we touch on a couple things, and some of those have to do with the recognition of what we've done, and now trying to ameliorate some of those impacts. I mean, how to try to mitigate some of those. How are those efforts going around the world? Hatcheries, undamming of rivers. I mean, are we at least headed in a direction you think might be the right one?
In tiny increments. We are headed in that direction, but so some dams have been taken down. Actually, quite a few dams have been taken down, but only a few salmon dams have been taken down. And the really big damaging ones, like the ones on the Columbia, are not coming down. In New England, where there's an incredible amount, there's thousands of dams on the Connecticut River alone.
Right.
In New England, most of the dams are useless. They were built to power mills that are now boutique shopping centers and restaurants. If you've been to Lowell or any of those big mill towns in northern Massachusetts lately, you see that they're not mills anymore.
Right.
And but there's some problems. One is that it's not always completely clear who owns the mill that you want to tear down. So there's a legal problem. We're talking about a mill that was built in 1850 something by a company that no longer exists. But a bigger problem is it's extremely expensive. And part of the expense, they took 2 dams down in the Penobscot.
Right.
Huge expense. They're still spending on it. Because after you take the dams down, you have to restore the river. You have to put it back the way it was. And it's not as though you take down the dam and just magically the gravel reappears and the salmon run in. And, you have to engineer this whole thing. It's enormously expensive, huge projects.
And it's a restoration of the banks and the whole ecosystem, right? I mean, yeah.
Right. So, this has been done on the Ewell in Washington State and on the Penobscot. And it's slated to be done in Klamath in California and some other places. As I say, heading slowly in the right direction. Also, it's encouraging that building new hydroelectric dams is no longer as openly received. When these big dams on the Columbia were built that completely messed up Pacific salmon, they were hailed by all the progressive people. Woody Guthrie sang a song about it, because it was creating jobs. It was part of the New Deal. It was part of Roosevelt's New Deal. It was considered a very, progressive thing to do.
So we have good hindsight to see. Well, that's the advantage of that.
We speak through that now. And there is the argument, well, it's not nuclear and it's not fossil fuel. And you probably can argue that it's not as damaging as oil or certainly coal, even clean coal.
Right.
Or, not as dangerous as nuclear. But it's not like those are the only alternatives.
Right. What are folks doing? I mean, you mentioned a little bit what's going on in Japan. I mean, what are folks doing? I mean, are there lessons to be learned from what other folks are doing around the world for our situation?
Well, they have made a lot of progress in Europe, in England, and France, a little bit in Germany. There's a few salmon making it up the Thames River again, and in the Seine in France, and so they are restoring some rivers. You get into this issue of hatcheries, which is a very complicated issue.
Yes.
Originally, in the 18th and 19th century, when they first started figuring out how to do hatcheries, they thought this is great. We can just fish the hell out of the rivers and just make more fish and put them in. Doesn't work like that. It's extremely difficult to figure out how a hatchery can produce fish that will prosper in that river.
Right, but I also point out or ask you that, I mean, there are examples. I mean, we had one right here in Gloucester for 70 years, turning out codfish by the billions. And again, that's from the 19th century right up until the 50s. But knowing where juvenile spawning grounds are and all the things that we know now that we didn't know then, the question is, can that be brought back in a way that uses the new technologies to actually increase the survivability. I mean, you know, these fish like cod and salmon.
The fair answer here is some people say yes and some people say no. There are some people, including my publisher for this book, Patagonia, that
Yes.
are
Yeah.
dead set against hatcheries. And
Say again. I'm sorry.
they're just dead set against hatcheries.
Right.
You know,
Finfish hatcheries.
yes, and,
Right.
and just had conniptions that I could cite a few cases where it worked. Quote a few people who believed, some scientists who believed there was some future for hatcheries.
Well, of course, bivalve hatcheries are very successful in, you know, Matsu Bay and Japan. I mean, there's just
Well, like oyster hatcheries are successful, right. But that's because an oyster doesn't do anything.
right.
You don't have this issue. Well, a farmed oyster really doesn't have the skills of a wild oyster. They don't have any skills. But with a fish, especially a fish like salmon that has a very complicated life cycle, it's
Yes.
difficult to produce a fish that will have all those skills. And experience has shown that hatchery fish are not as successful as wild fish. I mean, you have to consider the fact that one of the great strengths of salmon is that they're so adaptable. They adapt to whatever their home river is. So if you have two rivers next to each other, the salmon will have completely different DNA. I'm talking about the same species.
Mm-hmm.
The same species in two different rivers, their DNA is more different than yours and mine. I haven't checked out yours, but I think it's the safest assumption.
Right.
And so when you're talking about reproducing a fish for a river that has that very specific DNA for that river, it's a very complicated thing. We learned more and more about it. Originally they were hatching salmon in California and selling them in New England and around the world, and
Right.
wondering why it didn't work. It
They
worked
weren't
for a year or so, and then it collapsed. So it's a very complicated question.
So do you think that, I mean, just looking forward on this, do you think that political will and science can come together to save us in some respect, or is this decline an inevitable function of just the way we see the world and its economic models? And
Ask me in November.
Okay. Henry, make a note. Well, we're going to ask Mark in November. Is that any part of November or any particular? Yeah.
I mean, I used to think so. If you look at something like the Pebble Mine, which is a proposed gold mine in Bristol Bay, Alaska, where the world's largest wild salmon run is.
Mm-hmm.
And this mining company that has a history of toxic waste that ends up falling in the river. And so this mine should never take place there. And it was stopped. It wasn't going to be there until Trump got into power and the EPA was basically abolished. There's a Senate race there, and the Democrat Al Gross opposes it. The incumbent Sullivan favors it. A lot of people have realized, that you can't do things like this anymore. But they're up against politicians and some people who just, I don't know. They have a planet set aside for themselves after they wreck this one. I don't know. I'm not sure what their plan is.
I'm getting to, we have a few minutes left. I just wanted to also bring up the subject, and we talked about hatcheries. What's the take on fish farming?
Yeah. And this is another very complicated question, just in case there's anyone out there who reads thoroughly and remembers. I came out against fish farming in my cod book. I've since changed my mind. Not that fish farming is okay, but we have to try to make it okay because it provides a high quality protein for a reasonable price. That's something we should be doing. The original problem that why I opposed it was that they were feeding the salmon meal from wild fish, huge amounts of wild fish, so that if you ate a farmed salmon, you were killing far more wild fish than if you ate a wild fish. And they have addressed that.
I'm sorry.
They have addressed that problem, and they're continuing to try to address that problem. They're now down to about 50% fish meal. They're trying to get less. There's all sorts of interesting, fairly high-tech experiments with different kinds of protein to feed fish. There's the problem of sea lice, which are lice that prey on salmon, and
but they put them in these antibacterial baths to take the lice off. But I mean,
well, they do all kinds of things. They've got fish they've got lice-eating fish. The problem with the lice-eating fish is they overfish them. But now they're farming lice-eating fish. There's all sorts of things. And there's other problems too. There's problems with using bacteria because we have too much bacteria in food. But I have learned after years and years of covering environmental struggles that what you want to do is be a force for change, not a force necessarily to say, no, stop it, you can't do it, but say, no, if you're going to do this, you have to do it right. And to push for solutions to these problems. And I think there's a future in it. We're quite a ways off, but progress is being made, and fish farming companies have shown a willingness to try to find solutions. And this, the CEO of Marine Harvest in Scotland, which is a Norwegian company, it's the largest fish farmer in Scotland. And he said to me, you know, I talk to environmentalists all the time. And I know that he does, because I know some of the environmentalists who talk to him. Very easy, reasonable guy to talk to. And he said, but if I'm talking to somebody and their point of view is to ban all fish farming, then we don't have anything to say. And I think that's an important point, is that you have to keep options open for
yes, well,
work together for change rather than to just butt heads.
yes, right. Well, we say here that change is inevitable, but progress is not. So, you know, and also when the facts change, we change our mind, because, I mean, I don't know what people do other than that, but
John Maynard Keynes said that. He said when the facts do change, I change my conclusions. Why? What do you do?
Yeah, yes, right, exactly. There you go. Hey, folks, there it is, Salmon. Beautiful book, by the way, Mark. They just, I mean, you just did the photographs, the charts, everything, just a wonderful compendium of this span of time from the fossil record up until about 20 minutes ago. I think you really nailed the whole lifetime of this fishery and fish. And again, it's about us. So I want to just thank you on behalf of the Gloucester Writers Center for taking the time to talk with us today. And I hope we'll see you later in the story up here in Fishtown, yeah?
I hope so. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking to you. It's always a pleasure talking to Gloucester, wherever you are.